Well, I haven't made any videos for a while of any kind about any topic. Like I've said before, I'm not a very good YouTuber. I've got too many other things going on to be thinking about just pumping out videos all the time, you know? Besides, as we all know, most people who are putting out videos every day, they're just saying the same exact shit every day, which is, you know, it's like cable news. There's only so much people have to fucking say, you know? So if they got to fill 24 hours of airtime, they just keep saying the same thing over and over. And then everybody's obsessing about all this shit that nobody really seriously needs to care about half the time, and instead of just living their own life, you know? But anyways, came out here to Crane's Roost. Haven't been out here for a while. Took a day of vacation today, so I'm off the next 3 days. My one usual spot where I like to hang out is taken over by some young white guy with half his hair blonde and his pants hanging down around the crack of his ass, listening to gangster music. Anyways, what I was wanting to talk about, not that I am some world-renowned firearms expert or something, but just kind of like my layman's view of some stuff about Glock. I've seen some videos lately. I think the guy's channel is Trench Grenade. I think that's the one that I'm thinking of. He's done some Glock shit and some P320 stuff, you know, and, you know, torture testing them or whatever. And I saw his one video. He was talking about how all the Glock people are going to be crushed because the P320 is so much better than how the Glock performed in his testing. And I didn't watch the whole video. I did leave a little comment telling him that I've been watching this stuff, reading this stuff, shooting Glocks and stuff for almost 40 years, ever since they came here to the United States, because I'm an old guy, you know. Back in the day, you'd go to the gun store and you would look at revolvers and, you know, the Beretta 92 and the P226 and stuff like that showed up finally. You used to see some Browning PDAs, which then became, you know, the SIG P220 and things like that. VP70s or whatever, from H&K that had a trigger like an electric drill on them or something, you know. And then, you know, when Glock came along, it was such a big change. Everybody's like, oh, look at this plastic gun. But over 40 years, I've seen a lot of stuff, you know, people talking about all kinds of things and people testing them. Those of us who have been around for a while, kept up through the years with, sorry, I was trying to wipe something off the seat here. It turned out to be bird poop. Chuck Taylor testing the Glock. He had a Glock 17. Updates through the years when he was at like 33,000 rounds, and then like 75,000 and like 100,000, and supposedly I think by the time he called it quits on that, like about 175,000 rounds to this one Glock. And all the things that people did to them, crazy things, you know, dropping them out of helicopters and stuff, and to check them out and see how they were going to last. And so, you know, some young guy who wasn't even born when all that shit happens, banging one around and doing all kinds of crazy, unrealistic shit with one to see if he can make it stop running, really isn't that informative to those of us who've been around watching this shit for, you know, the last 4 decades. I've owned so many different Glocks through the years, shot a whole bunch more, and we all know what the Glock will do because it's been around for a long time, and military units all over the world, SAS, Navy SEALs, and all kinds of other people, and the FBI have put so many rounds to them. There are gun ranges that have examples with tens or hundreds of thousands of rounds through them with minimal parts breakage and stuff. It's fun to watch things on YouTube like the gauntlet testing and stuff, you know, burying them in sand and mud and all that kind of stuff, and trying to see if you can clog up the action and keep them from working, and then decide whether or not it passed or failed. You know, things that have very, very little to do with any kind of real world usage at all. But we already know from 40 years of having them out there what they do. The SIG P320, even the guys who first really popularized or publicized, I guess would be a better word, the drop safety thing, even those guys, when they first tested them, they loved it. And it was very, very reliable. You know, they even slung it out of a catapult and everything, and it still kept working. No one has ever, I think, debated the P320's ruggedness or its ability to keep working. You look at Grand Thumb, I think in his ice and mud testing, that the P320s put in a really good showing. But the problem is, there seem to be some inconsistencies somewhere with some of these things where they might go off when you don't want them to. And nobody's ever questioned their ability to keep going off when you want them to. It's the whether or not you can trust them if it's just there in your holster someday to not go off, which is a very important thing if you're walking around with a gun in your holster. And that just is kind of killing them. They're great guns as far as how they feel and all the options you have for accessorizing them and all of that. But when you compare it to a Glock, the Glock just has that edge of having been around for a while, and they don't just go off by themselves. I always wondered what was going on with that one incident, supposedly with the M17, or the M18, I guess, in the Air Force, the airman that got killed. It always sounded kind of strange to me. He was just taking off his holster, and it was in the gun, and it shot him in the chest. I was wondering, how does that even work? Why was he pointing at his chest while he's taking off his holster, you know? But we found out later that that was a bunch of bullshit. Even though all the SIG haters jumped on it, you know, here's yet another example. It was pretty obvious from the start there was something fishy about that story. But as far as the Glock goes, you know, actually, I recently found one of those Gen 1 reissues that they came out with a few years back at a local pawn shop. Guy said he'd sell it to me for like $455, including tax, you know. I think I can't pass it up probably for that price. Kind of a nostalgia thing. As much as I've been shooting lately all like Gen 4s and Gen 5s, it's kind of an interesting throwback to get one of those ones that's just like the originals. The thing that makes the Glock different from all these other guns, though, is the safety. And not necessarily the safety, let's say, but the trigger mechanism. You always see people when they talk about the subject of whether or not you should have a safety on a handgun, and they'll say, well, the safety with like a Glock or something is the holster. Have a really good, well-fitted holster, and that is your safety for the handgun. Once you pull it out, you know, then it's off safe, and it's just a question of keeping your finger off the trigger, which that sounds cool, you know, and all this stuff like, you know, my trigger finger is my safety and shit like that. As Ernest Langdon points out, though, the thing that keeps you out of trouble in a high-stress situation sometimes is the distance your finger has to move to make the gun go off. As cool as it sounds, all this other shit out there in real-world situations, you know, sometimes a little bit of leeway if you are in a high stress situation and get your finger on that trigger is useful. As I think it was an article by Masad Ayub a long time ago pointed out, it's easy to say keep your finger off the trigger until you're ready to shoot, but sometimes you got a bad guy at gunpoint. If you're standing there with your finger off the trigger, they don't believe you're going to shoot, and a lot of times that's what keeps you from having to shoot somebody, is the fact that they believe you will. And if you're just standing there and you've got your gun at like, you know, low ready or something kind of, or slightly you know, the muzzle slightly depressed off of target with your finger off the trigger, it's not the same as having it pointed at somebody's face with your finger on the trigger saying, back off, motherfucker, you know? There's a difference. Because some of these guys, they ain't afraid of guns. They've had guns pointed at them before. They've pointed guns at other people, and they kind of have a feeling when somebody's serious about what they're saying. And if you're standing there trying to follow all the safety rules with your finger off the trigger and the gun at low ready until you're actually ready to actually fire, you don't know how that's going to work out sometimes out there in the real world. And that's the big thing. So sometimes you just can't play it that way. Having a little bit extra leeway, maybe a double action trigger or something that's a little bit longer and isn't going to go off as soon as you touch the trigger, can keep you out of trouble. But the one thing people always say about having a safety on a handgun, they're like, well, a 1911, you need that because it's got like a really short, light trigger pull. And so you need a safety on those, a thumb safety. But the amazing thing is, you look at all these different modifications people do, and some of the newer striker-fired handgun designs, and what are they trying to shoot for? They're like, oh, we want to have that 1911 light trigger, super light. Some of these triggers that you see on these striker-fired guns, especially the ones where the striker is fully cocked and ready to go, those triggers are a lot lighter than some of the 1911s I've had through the years, for sure. And so if the whole having a safety thing applies to a 1911, wouldn't the same thing apply to a striker-fired gun that has an even shorter, lighter trigger? Basically, as it's been pointed out, a lot of these striker-fired guns, you're walking around with a cocked and unlocked 1911. The difference is, of course, you don't have a grip safety on it, or a thumb safety, you know? So, I mean, but you have to wonder about all these people who said, well, you know, you need a thumb safety because it's a 1911 and has a short, light trigger pull, but they want the same thing on their striker-fired guns. And that's where the Glock kind of makes people feel a little bit more at ease, because that striker is not, the striker spring is not fully compressed, and when you initially press the trigger, there's some take up there, and if you don't, assuming you haven't messed with the weight of the striker spring or the safety plunger that prevents the firing pin from going forward, you know, you've got a bit of resistance there. Certainly with the New York 1 trigger and stuff, you know, the spring in there and stuff like that, but you know, that was kind of a little bit too much of a good thing sometimes in terms of hitting your target. You know, so you had the NYPD, you know, every time they got in a shooting, you'd hear about all the bystanders they shot while they missed the bad guy, you know. They'd say, how can they shoot 60 rounds at some guy in a doorway and only hit him 3 times? It's probably because they had a crappy trigger in there that weighed like 10 pounds, and every time they tried to press the trigger, it pulled the gun off target, you know. So you can have too much of a good thing. But the safety concerns are very real, especially if you're equipping a police department full of people that, some of whom may be, you know, firearms aficionados and expert shooters, and some who may not. And no matter how expert a shooter you are, how good you are at hitting what you're shooting at, there are times when the primary consideration is not firing the gun. And, you know, Masad Ayub once pointed out, see, I'm going way back for some of you young guys who have never known a world without Glocks and stuff. But as he pointed out one time, police officers hold people at gunpoint more often than they shoot people. And it's the same thing for a private citizen, you know. You have somebody in your house pointing a gun at them, trying to get them to leave. Having that long double action trigger pull for the first shot is not necessarily a bad thing, you know. And when you do start to pull the trigger, if you start getting a little bit carried away and putting pressure on that trigger, in your vision you can see the hammer coming back too, and it tells you, oh, wait a minute, shit, I might have time here to stop what I'm doing. Whereas if you got some striker-fired pistol, especially something where there is hardly any movement in the trigger, the tiniest movement in the trigger, by the time you realize, oh, you're making a mistake, it's too bad, you know, you've already put a bullet through the person. And then you've got all those problems. It's easy to say, well, I'm justified in shooting the person, so what difference does it make? But obviously, if they can try and get you to say under oath that, oh, okay, yeah, I didn't mean to shoot him, you know, I was pressing the trigger and it went off without me expecting it, now then you accidentally shot the person, which is a totally different thing than deliberately shooting them in self-defense. So obviously you better say, yeah, it was deliberate. But the thing is, even if you were justified in doing it deliberately, your life is going to be hell probably in the aftermath. No matter how justified you were, shooting people, you know, is a very serious thing. And especially if you kill somebody, yeah, they might have been a piece of crap, but you know, their relatives are going to be on TV every day talking about what a sweet angel they were and how they mowed their grandma's lawn every Sunday, and trying to get all the liberal news anchors to show up and start a riot or something. And then what are you going to do, you know? So sometimes not firing the gun is very important. And these super light triggers on a lot of these striker-fired guns these days, it's very chic and cool, and everybody seems to be pursuing that. But for a self-defense gun that you're carrying daily on your person, it might not necessarily be the smartest thing. And the fact of the matter is, in the vast majority of situations, say even like a double action pistol, if you carry a double action gun with a hammer, right up close and personal, that first double action shot is not an impediment to hitting somebody in the chest when they're like 5 feet away from you, you know? If your first shot needs to be at somebody who's like, you know, 30 yards away in a mall shooting or something, then you can cock the hammer. But that initial close-in work that you might need if you really need to pull it out and use it now, the double action trigger is not that much of an impediment. Neither is a heavier trigger on a Glock or something like that. So that's where the argument kind of comes in. It's fashionable though with a lot of people now to, I'm no huge Glock fanboy or something, but like I say, you know, I've lived in a world with Glocks for 40 years almost, so it's, you know, it's obviously something that I've shot a lot of. And see, these, I know people have to come up with content for their YouTube channels and stuff, and especially in a world where everybody's trashing the P320, to come out with stuff showing how great the P320 is and how the Glock sucks in comparison or something is help you get views and controversy. You know, all these years later, people still are rocking Glocks and making it work. So sometimes the latest, greatest, even though as cool as it might be, there's a reason why a lot of these police departments and people still are sticking with Glocks. Anyways, that's just my layman's musings on this stuff. I've been seeing a lot of this stuff lately, and I guess now that I'm thinking about picking up another one that's not all tricked out, basic kind of Glock with iron sights and stuff that I'll probably start using for my daily carry gun. Even there though, it might have to compete some with my P320s Legion that I've got. On the other hand, there's something to be said for that super lightweight Glock. And just the standard unmodified trigger in it. Anyways, I've rambled on long enough. Just thinking about how I haven't made any videos for a while. And I thought I had the opportunity to swing down here, take a walk around, though I haven't been walking much. Anyways, I hope everyone enjoys their Labor Day weekend. Guess we're going to go out to the beach tomorrow, drop off one of our friends at the airport in Sanford, maybe head on out to New Smyrna or somewhere. But it's supposed to be rainy this weekend, so we'll see. Have a good one.